Hey everyone, I'm your host Anthony. We do content like this weekly, so hit the subscribe button and ring the bell to get notified. If you want more content like this, click the like button and please leave a comment. Thanks again for watching. Hey everyone, and welcome to the live class. We're very excited to have you here today and looking forward to a great lecture. My name is Anthony and I'm going to be your host for today. I'm joined on the line by Dr. Dickon Weatherby, the president and CEO at Optimal DX, who will be conducting most of the presentation today. I'm going to pass it off to him momentarily to kick off today's presentation on the topic of uncovering the hidden intelligence in the chemistry screen and CBC. But before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. I've muted everyone by default. And secondly, if you have any questions during the course of this live class, please submit them in the chat panel. The questions will come to me as the host, and I will be conducting a live Q&A with Dr. Weatherby at the end of the presentation. With that said, I'd like to hand it off to Dr. Weatherby to begin today's presentation.
Well, thank you, Anthony and Rupa Health, for having me on today. Welcome to Uncovering Hidden Intelligence. So I'm going to be focusing on a collection of tests that I think we're all very familiar with, known as the blood chemistry, metabolic panel, and also the complete blood count, or the CBC. As you'll see, I'm going to be demonstrating how we can use these very simple tests to uncover early detection of dysfunction. I think that's what our role is as functional medicine practitioners, really, is how do we uncover the early stages of dysfunction so we can put in place our treatment protocols to kind of bring people back from those dysfunctions to a state of optimal health. And given the time today, I'm going to be focusing on teaching you how to recognize 10 common metabolic patterns in the blood chemistry and hematology panels. I'm not going to go over an intro to functional blood or why we use optimal ranges and patterns and all that kind of stuff. I've got resources on that if you want to go over to my website, optimaldx.com. Now, why do I call this essential blood test number one? Because I'm a firm believer that every new patient that comes into your practice should have a blood test done. And I think that's everybody. Because biomarkers found on the chemistry screen and CBC are going to help us uncover multiple nutritional metabolic dysfunctions. It helps clarify potential organ and system dysfunctions, and they can also be used as gateway testing. Here we are presenting here for Rupa Health, who's got a tremendous amount of advanced testing at your disposal. And I would hazard to say that if you use the blood chemistry screen and the CBC, you can actually make a much more judicious decision about which of those tests to run. So this is a concept of gateway testing is something that I picked up from Dr. Jonathan Wright of the Tahoma Clinic up in Washington State. And he talked about how we can use testing to kind of as a gateway to further testing. Markers for digestive dysfunction that we're going to be talking about may prompt you to order a GI health panel or a comprehensive digestive stool analysis. They can also lead us to want to test for other blood biomarkers, such as advanced biomarkers for cardiometabolic dysfunction, blood sugar dysregulation, thyroid dysfunction, sex hormone dysfunction, all the things that I'm not going to be talking about today, but I have talked about in previous lectures that I've done. Also, it can lead us to wanting to order some of the more familiar tests from functional medicine, the Dutch test, the salivary hormone test, organic acid testing, etc. So our presentation today, we're going to be talking about Rupa Health, the complete metabolic panel, and the CBC. I'm going to be showing you what Rupa has available to you on that level to be able to go ahead and purchase these and run these tests on your patients. I'm going to be talking about, the biomarkers themselves, which biomarkers to have and which ones to include on various different panels. I may even make some suggestions for other biomarkers that we're not going to be talking about today. And then the meat and the potatoes of this presentation are the metabolic patterns. So that's our presentation outline. I know you can see me on the screen, but this is my ugly mug. I'm a naturopathic physician. I graduated in 1998 from National College of Naturopathic Medicine, Portland, Oregon. It's now National University of Natural Medicine. And really from the moment of graduation, and actually even while I was in naturopathic medical school, I've dedicated myself to the study of functional blood chemistry analysis. And that's really sort of where I'm going to be taking you today. And that's sort of my level of expertise. My best-selling book, Blood Chemistry and CBC Analysis, Clinical Laboratory Testing from a Functional Perspective, is being used by thousands of healthcare practitioners around the world, sort of the seminal text in some ways in this particular field. Shameless promotion here, you can go over to Amazon and get a copy for yourself. As Anthony pointed out, I'm also the founder and CEO of Optimal DX and the creator of the ODX software application that takes the analysis, the interpretation, reporting of blood testing to the next level and beyond, with a state-of-the-art comprehensive and fully interactive functional health report. And then finally, I've had the privilege of teaching my methods of functional blood chemistry to thousands of practitioners worldwide through the ODX Academy and my FBCA Mastery training program. So now that's out of the way, let's get on to the topic of today's presentation, uncovering the hidden intelligence in the complete metabolic panel and CBC. All right, let's start off by looking at the complete blood count. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. I'm sure you've ordered hundreds of them, but it's a very, very standard panel of biomarkers, universally found on panels from the main labs like Quest and LabCorp, or hospital lab panels. Rupa Health at this point provides blood testing from 3 companies, Boston Heart, Access Medical Labs, and Vibrant America. So let's take a look at a screenshot of Rupa to see what each lab has, and also the cost, because I'm absolutely blown away that the cost for running this test is so unbelievably low. In fact, I think even the cost of probably having the blood drawn is more expensive than the actual blood test that you're going to be running. So let's start off here. This is your little panel, your portal that you can use to order. As you can see, I've selected Access, Boston, and Vibrant, and I put in CBC here up at the top to be able to select what we want to look at. So CBC with differential, it's about $3. So the 2 main companies that you can order CBCs are Vibrant America and Access Medical. Let's dive into this in a little bit more detail. This is Vibrant's CBC panel. As you can see, they've got the CBC with the differential. So basically you're going to get the white blood cell count, platelet count, and then your percentage values for all your various different white blood cells. And then also you're going to get your red blood cell indices as well. And then you're going to get your absolute neutrophil count, MPV, and that sort of thing. So for, I think this is $3. Maybe Anthony, you could talk to this at the end, but this seems extremely valuable to be able to order a panel like this. So that's the CBC. Let's talk now about a metabolic panel. So there are a couple of different types of metabolic panels. There's the basic metabolic panel and the comprehensive. I would highly recommend that you focus mostly on the comprehensive. And again, this is $14. I mean, this is an extraordinary amount of information that you're going to get for a very small spend for your patients. So this is Access's basic metabolic panel. It's got glucose, BUN, creatinine, sodium, potassium, chloride, CO2, calcium, and GFR. And then when you expand that a little bit, it's going to add in some other values here from Vibrant. That's their basic metabolic panel. And then the comprehensive, again, it's going to add in a few more things. You're going to get albumin here, and also your total protein. As you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, we're actually going to talk about how you can actually get additional biomarkers from just this simple list here. For instance, you can actually calculate the total globulin level from the total protein and the albumin. So total protein, subtract the albumin, you get the total globulin. In fact, my software program will do that for you as well. You're also going to get the sodium potassium ratio, something that you can calculate from this, really helpful for looking at stress and adrenal insufficiency and things. We'll actually talk about that later on in the presentation. You can calculate the anion gap from potassium chloride, CO2, and sodium. So that'll tell you about metabolic pH issues plus B vitamin needs. And also you can calculate the AST ALT ratio, the ratio between these 2 liver enzymes. And again, I'll talk about that as well. And you can also get the total bilirubin here. So that's Access's comprehensive metabolic panel. With Vibrant, you actually get the direct bilirubin. So now another thing you can do is you can actually calculate the indirect bilirubin. Basically, you subtract the total, subtract the direct bilirubin from the total, and that will give you the indirect. So another freebie biomarker there. I also think that we need to be adding some biomarkers. I've been doing this long enough to know that Labs tend to pull biomarkers out of their complete metabolic panels, and one of those was uric acid. I think uric acid is a really, really important biomarker to be looking at. So I went in and I looked at uric acid on Rupa, and it's going to cost you about $1.50 if you do it from Boston Heart, which is actually your urinalysis. So I wouldn't. So no, that is uric acid. That's a serum. So $4 from them. So for about $1.50, you can get uric acid, and that's really, really helpful too. I also think you should add LDH, another liver enzyme, for $1.60 from Vibrant, $2 from Access. And again, you can just add that to your panel as well. And we'll be going through some of these biomarkers in the metabolic patterns section as well. GGT is another biomarker that was pulled out of the complete metabolic panel. Again, I really think that it deserves to be there for a couple of dollars. It's a really exceptionally good biomarker. And lastly, I think we should add in an iron measurement. I'm putting here ferritin. Really like to look at ferritin to help us with our iron deficiency. And in fact, we'll go through a pattern for iron deficiency anemia later on where we look at the iron panel. But you can add ferritin, and we'll talk about some of the other iron biomarkers as well that you could potentially add to. So what we're doing here is we're taking this complete metabolic panel and we're sort of expanding it a little bit by adding in these 4 biomarkers. All right, so let's take a look at the biomarkers themselves. So the biomarkers that you want to have on your CBC and the ones that we're going to be taking a look at in terms of anemia, nutrient deficiencies, also immune insufficiency is going to be our final pattern today. So we look at the red blood cell count, hematocrit hemoglobin, then the indices themselves, looking at the white blood cell count. This is the differential here, and then looking at the platelet count. And then these are the ones that I suggest that we look at on our complete metabolic panel. It's going to include some of those ones that we've added. You're going to get fasting glucose, BUN creatinine ratio. It's going to be sort of kidney markers, calcium, total protein albumin, sodium, potassium, CO2 chloride, liver enzymes, basic liver enzymes here, ALT and AST, and then alkaline phosphatase, really helpful enzyme to look at, and then bilirubin total and direct. And these are some of the additional biomarkers that we can calculate. We can calculate the sodium potassium ratio. We can calculate the indirect bilirubin. We can calculate the globulin. We can calculate those AST, ALT, AST ratios. We can calculate the anion gap. And then also the neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. Fantastic ratio to be taking a look at. And then finally, the additional biomarkers that we want to add in here, uric acid, LDH, GGT, and ferritin. All right, let's dive now into the metabolic patterns themselves. And the whole purpose of this is going beyond just your standard approach of looking at biomarker values, which would be get the piece of paper up, run your finger down, see what's out of normal. If it's out of normal, then pay attention to it. If it's not out of normal, consider it to be normal, and then move on. What we're looking at is basically the diamonds in the rough. What is the information that we can glean when we look at optimal ranges, optimal functional medicine ranges, optimal physiological ranges, to be able to determine what's happening for our patients? All right, so these are the patterns that we're going to be looking at today. There are, of course, many, many more. I've got a whole training that goes into all this in way more detail, but for the sake of the time that we have today, I want to take a look at these. We're going to look at blood proteins. That helps us look at hypochlorhydria, or low stomach acid. I want to look at the liver panel, so AST, ALT, and GGT. I'm going to show you a little trick to kind of get more information out of that liver panel. Then we're going to like moving into the gallbladder, looking at GGT, bilirubin, and alkaline phosphatase. Then we're going to be looking at albumin, looking at liver dysfunction and oxidative stress, looking at uric acid as a marker for poor detoxification, looking at alkaline phosphatase as a marker for zinc deficiency, looking at ferritin and MCV. Ferritin is going to help with our iron. MCV is going to help with our B12 deficiency anemia. We're going to be looking at LDH, reactive hypoglycemia. And we'll be looking at potassium and sodium in relationship to adrenal dysfunction. We're going to be looking at BUN and creatinine in terms of kidney and genitourinary dysfunction. And then finally looking at white blood cells and the differential count in this view of looking at immune insufficiency. All right, so let's take a look at the serum proteins. So serum proteins in the blood are very, very helpful for uncovering digestive dysfunction and protein deficits in the body. Now, nutrient deficits are mostly dietary protein deficits that are either from a lack of amino acids in the diet or poor breakdown of available amino acids from the diet, usually due to digestive dysfunction. So it can be very helpful to follow serum blood proteins as you institute a digestive protocol or get your patients to increase their dietary protein. So we're going to look at two things. We're looking at total proteins and we're going to be looking at globulins. Remember, you can calculate the globulin by subtracting the albumin from the total protein, and that will give you the globulin value from that complete metabolic panel. Total serum protein is composed of albumin and globulin. So the sum of albumin and globulin gives us our total serum protein. So any conditions that affect the albumin level and the globulin level will impact the total protein value. So what are some of those things that can affect that? Well, protein is affected by protein digestion. So where does protein digestion take place? In the stomach through hydrochloric acid's activity on proteins, absorption, and also assimilation. So you should be checking serum proteins for functional GI problems, nutritional deficiencies, and also dehydration. Total serum globulin can be used to assess inflammatory conditions. So that could be a degenerative or infectious processes in the body. And these processes are associated with an increased production of antibodies, which is synthesized from globulins. So with accompanying subjective indicators, a total globulin can help to confirm an underlying digestive problem of an inflammatory or an infectious nature. So the optimal ranges, I like to see total proteins between 6.9 and 7.4, and I like to see globulins between 2.4 and 2.8. So hypochlorhydria. We're not going to talk a lot about hypochlorhydria here. It's basically a condition of decreased output of hydrochloric acid and pepsin from parietal cells of the stomach. In fact, I was interested today to get Dr. Datis Karazian's newsletter, and his podcast this week is all about hypochlorhydria and also gallbladder insufficiency, two things that we'll be talking about today. So very much an issue that we should be paying attention to. So what causes hypochlorhydria? Stress. Our patients are also on protein pump inhibitors, autoimmune diseases that can attack the parietal cells. Marijuana usage can cause hypochlorhydria. A lot of females that are going through menopause often experience that as well. And we also see more hypochlorhydria as our patients are aging. It's also due to the need for the following nutrients. So we need chloride, hydrochloric acid. So low serum chloride is a marker for hypochlorhydria. We also need zinc. Zinc is a rate-limiting enzyme in the production and synthesis of hydrochloric acid. And we also need thiamine. So that's another nutrient that we need as well. So these are the primary nutritional factors that are required for the synthesis of HCl in the body. Paradoxically, adequate HCl is needed to properly absorb those nutrients as well. So what's our pattern here? Typically, we see the total globulin levels start to go up. This is associated with a decreased production of HCl in the stomach. And conversely, we will also see the albumin levels starting to go down, which could actually give us a normal serum protein. Remember, serum protein is the sum of the globulin and the albumin. So as the globulin levels start to go up and the albumin levels start to go down, the sum of those two actually can lead to a normal total protein. But depending on how severe the low albumin is, you can actually get a total protein that is slightly decreased as well. You also see your BUN levels start to go up. Not enough to trigger kidney as a kidney marker, but definitely as it starts to creep up above 16 and you're seeing the globulin levels start to go up and maybe the albumin levels starting to go down, you're starting now to put together this picture of hypochlorhydria in your patients. You also see that the serum phosphorus level will start to go down. And then there are other values, all of which we can measure on the complete metabolic panel, with the exception probably of iron. You're going to start to see shifts in these biomarkers as well. MCV is going to go up. MCH is going to go up. Calcium levels are going to go down. Remember, calcium also requires hydrochloric acid in order for the calcium to be liberated from the food matrix. So another biomarker that is associated here with the proper digestion and absorption of a particular nutrient. And the same thing with iron. Iron levels will start to go down as well. CO2 starts to go down, anion gap starts to go up. Anion gap is a marker for thiamine. As I mentioned, thiamine is very much necessary for the synthesis of HCl. You also see alkaline phosphatase go down, as you'll see in a moment. Low alk phos is a sign of zinc deficiency. So this is a hypochlorhydria pattern. I see this all the time. I like to look at patient symptomology as well to make sure that the patient is experiencing digestive dysfunction, indigestion, difficulty with proteins, maybe gas and bloating and things like that, which are all symptomology of the stomach acid deficiency. And then you start to see this as well. And then you can start working with them potentially to replace stomach acid, obviously paying attention to the fact that there might be irritation of the stomach lining as well. All right, next series of biomarkers, classic triad, the AST, ALT, and GGT, commonly known as the liver panel or the liver enzymes. So these are your main liver enzymes. As I mentioned, GGT has been taken out of the complete metabolic panel, but I want you to put it back in again. So these are all really helpful for elucidating a developing liver gallbladder dysfunction and also a developed liver gallbladder pathology. So I want to cover an important rule of thumb now that I've come to rely on when we look at these three biomarkers. So let's look at our optimal values first. So AST, I like to see between 10 to 26, ALT also between 10 to 26, and GGT between 10 to 17. Low levels of these are suggestive of a B6 deficiency, and also for GGT, magnesium and glutathione deficiency as well. So here's this rule of thumb. If you see the AST increased above the ALT and the GGT, consider that the problem or area of involvement is possible outside the liver and biliary tree. So maybe nothing to do necessarily with the liver, most likely to be the heart, could be muscle, could be kidneys. If the ALT is increased above AST and GGT, consider that the problem or area of involvement is possible inside the liver. So we're looking now at a liver, potentially a liver issue itself. If the GGT is increased above the other two, problem or area of involvement is possible outside the liver, but within the biliary tree, gallbladder, common bile duct, maybe even pancreas itself. So this is a really nice, simple way of looking at those three biomarker values, which one is most elevated, above optimal, and consider that the area of involvement might be more likely to be outside of the liver, inside the liver, or in the biliary tree. So what are AST, ALT, and GGT? They're all what we call transferase enzymes. They're present in highly metabolic tissues. They typically get liberated into the bloodstream following cell damage or anything in the body that is causing the breakdown of cells. AST is more specific for detection of problems in the cardiovascular system, skeletal muscle, heart, definitely in the liver, kidney, and lungs, and primarily the locations for AST. ALT, primarily in the liver, but also in the skeletal muscle, the heart, and the kidneys. And then GGT is the liver and the gallbladder, maybe even the prostate, and also the pancreas. Any of you that have done hospital medicine will know that they can look at the ratios of AST to ALT following a heart attack to kind of really pinpoint when the heart attack happened, because AST levels will start to go up really quickly following a heart attack, and then ALT levels start to follow afterwards. let's look at this ratio. I like looking at ratios because it's sort of a way of being able to get even more value out of the biomarkers that we're checking. So there is some evidence that the ratio of AST to ALT is an indicator of emerging liver dysfunction. So this is from research in Journal of Cardiovascular Diabetology. A retrospective study in JAMA concluded that progressive liver functional impairment is reflected by an increase in the AST-ALT ratio. So the progressive liver disease they were looking at is the progression of cirrhosis of the liver. Its progression is associated with an increase in the ratio and increase in AST. Therefore, if we can identify this early, we might be able to institute our protocols to correct this. Pretty easy to calculate. You just take your AST level divided by your ALT level, and you have the ratio. Moving on here, let's look at our gallbladder markers now, looking at GGT, alkaline phosphatase, and bilirubin, getting to the bottom of your patient's gallbladder problems. So GGT, as I mentioned, is most helpful in elucidating and developing liver gallbladder dysfunction, liberated into the bloodstream following cell damage or destruction, found in highest quantities in the gallbladder, but also in the prostate and the pancreas. An enzyme we haven't talked about is alkaline phosphatase, a group of isoenzymes, has a maximal activity at a pH of 9 to 10, hence the reason why it's called alkaline phosphatase, and originates in bone, liver, intestines, skin, placenta. It's one of those biomarkers that goes up very high in teenagers, where their long bones are developing. Alkaline phosphatase levels will go up. In the liver, formed by liver and biliary mucosal cells excreted in the bile, increased ALT levels can occur with any type of liver dysfunction. Is especially sensitive to obstruction in the biliary tract. So again, we want to see that between 70 to 100. Looking at total bilirubin, again, I think one of the companies gave you total and direct. Total bilirubin, bilirubin is formed from the breakdown of hemoglobin from red blood cells by the reticular endothelial cells of the spleen and the bone marrow, transported in an unconjugated form from those cells to the liver, where it becomes conjugated or made water soluble and excreted via the gallbladder in the bile. So increased serum levels of bilirubin occur with excessive red blood cell destruction or a problem in the liver or gallbladder that prevents the normal excretion of bile. I think one of the things to remember is that oxidative stress can actually cause premature red blood cell destruction. So bilirubin levels can start to go up when there is oxidative stress in the body. So direct bilirubin is the bilirubin that has been conjugated or made water soluble and is excreted in the bile. An increase in direct is usually associated with a dysfunctional blockage in the liver, gallbladder, or biliary tree. So useful for help and quite helpful for looking at this gallbladder issue. Indirect levels typically will go up when there is a premature breakdown of red blood cells. We're going to look at total cholesterol here. We're not going to be talking about the lipid panel in this presentation. So there are a few points where we will actually be measuring or talking about cholesterol. Typically, we look at cholesterol through the lens of cardiovascular disease. But what's not commonly known is that a decreased cholesterol is strongly associated with gallbladder dysfunction. In fact, Dr. Joseph Mercola, I'm sure you're familiar with Mercola.com, he said that the most common cause of non-statin-induced decreased cholesterol is gallbladder dysfunction. So it's a nice marker here for gallbladder dysfunction. All right, so we've got two potential things to look at here with, from a sort of functional perspective, is looking at biliary dysfunction, looking at biliary stasis and biliary insufficiency. So a moderate rise in GGT, typically above 17, but within the normal level, and some of these other biomarkers can alert us to biliary dysfunction, a developing problem within the biliary tree that is more functional in nature. And one of the things to remember is that if it's left unchecked, it probably will lead to overt pathology. I'm sure all of you have worked with patients that have had their gallbladders removed or have gone through acute gallbladder crises. Well, the early stages of biliary obstruction or the need to have your gallbladder removed are these two conditions, biliary stasis and biliary insufficiency. And you don't suddenly just wake up one morning with obstruction in your gallbladder. Well, you might actually wake up one morning with obstruction in your gallbladder, but generally it's a slow progressive condition. Now, as functional medicine practitioners, wouldn't it be great if we had a way to be able to come in, take a look at blood work and go, ooh, it looks like your GGT levels and some of your liver enzymes and some of your other biomarkers are starting to rise. Let's take a look at some of the subjective indicators, as we'll talk about in a few moments, to see whether or not the gallbladder is symptomatic for you right now. Not necessarily symptomatic in terms of obstruction, but symptomatic in terms of this gallbladder distress. We could also do a physical exam. We could do the Murphy's sign. I'm not going to go into that today, but a physical exam technique for actually palpating and seeing the level of discomfort in the liver when you do direct palpation. So what is biliary insufficiency? Well, this is the inability of the liver cells to produce adequate amounts of bile. One of the hallmark signs of biliary insufficiency is a tan or clay-colored stool. Another cause of biliary dysfunction is biliary stasis, and this is the condition caused by the marked thickening of the bile. It's due to a number of different reasons. Supersaturation of the bile caused by increase in cholesterol secretion, decrease in bile acid formation, decrease in phosphatidylcholine secretion. So these are very real issues that our patients are dealing with. And again, like I said, Dr. Datis Karazian in his newsletter today, I'm not sure if you follow his work or not, he's very well known for his work on the thyroid. His podcast is devoted to what he calls bile sludge, which is biliary stasis. So how can we look at the complete blood count and also the complete metabolic panel to tell whether or not a patient might be moving in that direction? Well, the GGT levels will be starting to increase above 17. Bilirubin levels will start to go up above 9. You're starting to see your alkaline phosphatase level go up above 100. And your AST and ALT may be normal or increased above 26. So if you're starting to get that flavor and starting to get that picture in a blood work, start asking some questions. Do you have pain between your shoulder blades? Do you have light or clay-colored stools? Do you have greasy or shiny stools, which is a sign of steatorrhea or inability to digest fat, which finds its way into the stool? Shouldn't be there. Something that patients may or may not talk about. Headache over the eyes, a bitter taste in the mouth, especially after meals. Stomach that is upset by greasy foods. A history of nausea that might be unexplained. It's not morning sickness. You might actually have a history of morning sickness. This is a classic finding with biliary problems. Dry skin, itchy feet, skin that peels from the feet, a history of gallbladder attacks, and then finally a dark orange urine. A bile pigment can actually find its way into the urine. So if left unchecked, if we're not doing this type of analysis of blood, and we're not paying attention to the strong subjective indicators, and we're not doing that physical exam finding, the functional physical of our patients, if this is left unchecked and undiagnosed and untreated, it will likely lead to stone formation. And so small, tiny little stones may not be a problem, but when they get well established in the body, they can actually lead to overt obstruction. So that kind of leads us into our next issue here. When I said small stones can actually block the hepatocytes. There are conditions that might cause damage to the liver cells. It could cause intrahepatic biliary obstruction. So what's happening, if you remember back to your histology, there's these functional units or the triad of cells within the liver itself that causes that synthesizes and then moves bile through the liver into the gallbladder. Well, they can become blocked. So you're going to start to see that your elevated total bilirubin levels will start to go up. Indirect bilirubin levels will go up. You're going to see GGT levels now starting to go above the normal level and such. But the big one to pay attention to is what we call the extrahepatic biliary obstruction. Now, we've moved out of the realm of dysfunction. We're now moving into the realm of overt pathology. So this is the condition of calculi, stone formation in the gallbladder itself. It can be mild, it can be severe, it can be so severe that the patient goes into a major gallbladder attack and has to have their gallbladder removed. Remember, biliary obstruction has its genesis in biliary stasis. Biliary stasis provides the seed for calculi or stone formation. So in this state, we're going to start seeing things way above the normal level, 85 or more in GGT, alkaline phosphatase above 140, AST, ALT potentially above 55, elevated total bilirubin starting to go way above 1.2, direct bilirubin starting to go up. In this situation, depends on how severe the condition is, you can potentially work with your clients to bring them back from this place. But my recommendation is use the complete metabolic panel to identify when someone is moving in this direction. Are they trending towards this? And if so, let's back them away from it. Finishing up our little conversation on proteins and the liver, I want to talk about albumin in its relationship to liver dysfunction and oxidative stress. I like to see albumin between 4 and 4.5. If you're in standard international units, it'd be 40 to 50. So albumin, one of the major blood proteins, serum levels are affected by the health of the liver, which is the primary site of albumin synthesis. So albumin levels are affected by liver and or digestive dysfunction. So when we see a decreased albumin, can be an indication of liver dysfunction, can also be indication of digestive dysfunction due to HCl need that we talked about earlier. And it can also be a marker for oxidative stress. So what is oxidative stress? And again, we're not measuring oxidative stress in the body here. What we're doing is we're measuring the effect that oxidative stress has on certain blood biomarkers. Oxidative stress associated with exposure to environmental pollutants, inflammatory diseases cause oxidative environment in the body, low antioxidant status, so patients that aren't consuming foods that are high in antioxidants, maybe not taking antioxidants as supplements, and is actually a major factor in chronic disease. So a decreased albumin associated with liver dysfunction, but is also a strong indicator of a developing oxidative stress or excess free radical activity in the body. Let's take a look at our pattern here. So total cholesterol level suddenly below its historic value is a sign of oxidative stress. This is a pattern that I picked up from Dr. Harry Eidner, who is considered to be one of the granddads of functional blood. He said, take a look at the historical levels of cholesterol. And this is one of the things I love about my software program is that we provide a historical reporting of all of the values over time. So if you have cholesterol that's 200, 195, 180, and then suddenly it drops down to like 155. It's that sudden drop that we're looking for. It's a sign of an oxidative pattern happening in the body. If you're seeing that, along with this decreased albumin, decreased platelet count, decreased lymphocyte count, increased total globulins, your uric acid levels will be slightly increased. You may also see increased ferritin, bilirubin, and LDL levels. These are all things that we look at collectively to give us a picture of whether or not oxidative stress is an issue for this particular patient. And again, like I'm saying, we're not measuring oxidative stress. We're measuring is the influence that oxidative stress has on certain biomarker values. We talked at that particular pattern about uric acid. So let's take a look at uric acid now as a measure of poor detoxification. So uric acid, produced primarily in the liver, is produced from the end product of purine, nucleic acid, and nucleoprotein metabolism. From a biochemical perspective, uric acid is the end product of xanthine oxidase activation. So xanthine oxidase is an enzyme that is upregulated with reduced tissue oxygenation. So any situation that causes the tissue oxygenation of the body to go down, classic example of this would be COVID. COVID causes tissue oxygenation to go down. You start to see uric acid levels starting to go up. So increased uric acid levels are seen conventionally as a marker for gout, renal failure, and leukemia. What we'll be looking at actually is a decreased uric acid. And this is a marker for liver detoxification issues. Now, again, I want to be really clear here. We're not measuring detoxification. What we're measuring is the action of certain nutrients that we'll talk about in a few moments that have an impact on phase 2 liver detox. So xanthine oxidase, that's that enzyme that converts purine bases into uric acid. It requires molybdenum as a cofactor. to function optimally. So low levels of molybdenum, which is actually quite common, is going to compromise xanthine oxidase activity, leading to a decreased uric acid level. Molybdenum may or may not ring a bell for those of you that have studied liver detox, but it is an integral part to the process called sulfoxidation. Sulfoxidation is one of the 6 phase 2 liver detox pathways. So our pattern here for looking at poor detoxification. So suspect poor detoxification due to low molybdenum levels if there's a decreased uric acid, so below 3 in women and below 3.5 in men. And we will have a normal MCV and a normal MCH. The reason for that is that when MCV and MCH start to go out as well with decreased uric acid, it can mean different things. Also, there's some subjective indicators that go along with this. People that have issues with self-oxidation typically have sensitivity to exhaust fumes and gases, sensitivity to perfumes and fragrances. They can be very sensitive to MSG. They can be sensitive to sulfites used in food preparation, red wine, hot dog, preserved meats, and things like that. So again, these are all questions that I have on questionnaires that I use to help sleuth out kind of what is the subjective indicators that are happening here as well. So low uric acid associated with this poor detox pattern. Let's look at zinc deficiency. We met alkaline phosphatase in the gallbladder where elevated levels were an indication of gallbladder problems. We're now going to look at it in terms of decreased levels. So I didn't mention this, but alkaline phosphatase, as I mentioned earlier, is a group of isoenzymes, but it is actually what they call a metalloenzyme. This is a family of zinc-dependent enzymes. So decreased levels of alkaline phosphatase below 70 is associated with a zinc deficiency. White blood cell and or red blood cell zinc levels may also be decreased along with a low normal or decreased total white count. Again, I like to look at other aspects of metabolism and biochemistry. So I like to look and see, well, what other things does zinc do in the body? Well, it's very important for tissue growth and skin integrity. Very important for the immune system. I have a whole series of articles on Optimal DX around zinc's role in COVID. So if you want to go over there to my blog and take a look at those. It's essential for cellular processes of translation and transcription, and also for EFA metabolism. So the conversions of those delta-6 desaturase is the enzyme that is requires zinc as well. I also like to look at the symptoms of a deficiency. So if we're seeing a decreased alkaline phosphatase level, there's a couple of things that I like to do. One, do a zinc taste test. Again, I'm not going to go through this, but there is a zinc tally that you can do. It's an oral test for zinc deficiency. Also like to look at their nails, white spots on the nails, reduced sense of smell or taste, which is kind of why it has a relationship to COVID, cuts that are slow to heal, patients that have got bad acne, especially in their adult stage, susceptibility to colds, infections, and flus. Oh, I get every single cold that comes along. My kids bring all these colds back. It could be a zinc deficiency. You want to make sure that the zinc levels are replete in our patients, especially looking at it through the lens of the immune system. And then finally, benign prostatic hypertrophy. For those male patients that you work with that might have urinary symptoms and you're suspecting, or maybe you've even diagnosed BPH, zinc levels are important for that condition as well. All right, let's take a look now. We've talked about our first couple of nutrients, molybdenum and zinc. Now we're going to be looking at nutrient deficiencies in relationship to anemia. So anemia is a condition in which there is a decreased amount of hemoglobin, decreased number of circulating red blood cells, and a decreased hematocrit. One of the things I want to really convey here is that anemia is a symptom, it's not a disease. And so the cause of an anemia must be sought out. So in the context of this presentation, we're going to be looking at nutritional causes of anemia, looking at deficiencies of iron, and then deficiencies of vitamin B12 and folate. Anemia can also be caused by increased red blood cell hemolysis, a decrease in production of red blood cells. So the nutritional components concerned with anemia are very, very common and things that we can take a look at, but there are also a number of other conditions that are associated with causing anemia as well, we must pay attention to, but outside of the realms of this particular presentation. So we're going to look here at our red blood cell indices. Now, this is going to tell us whether or not an anemia is present. And then, of course, we need to find out what kind of anemia. So we'll start out here with the MCV. I like to see it between 82 and 89.9. This is a measure of the volume in cubic microns of an average single red blood cell. So this is indication of whether or not the red blood cell levels are large or whether they're small. So I'm going to throw out some terms here that you're probably all very familiar with when you went through lab science and maybe you've forgotten. So, but it is important if you're looking at anemia and you're looking at the research, there are certain terms that they throw out there, and it's important for us to know what those terms are. So whenever they're talking about the size of a red blood cell, they talk about it whether it is normocytic, meaning normal in size, microcytic, meaning small, or large macrocytic. So normocytic, microcytic, and macrocytic, that's all referring to the MCV. The red blood cell count, pretty self-explanatory. It's the amount of red blood cells in a known volume. Hematocrit is expressed as a percentage of the volume of red blood cells in the known volume of centrifused blood. This usually parallels that red blood cell count when the cells are of normal size. Pattern doesn't hold true when the red blood cells are small or large, i.e. microcytic or macrocytic. Hemoglobin, again, how much hemoglobin is in the red blood cell. And then we have MCH and MCHC. MCH is a calculated value, is an expression of the average weight of hemoglobin. Mean corpuscular hemoglobin is what that stands for. So it's the average weight of hemoglobin per red blood cell. MCHC is also a calculated measurement, mean corpuscular hemoglobin concentration. It's the average concentration of hemoglobin in the red blood cell using hematocrit and hemoglobin. And I'm going to throw another term out here, and that is the term of chromicity. So anemias can be described as hypochromic or hyperchromic. And so the MCHC is the value that gives us the chromicity. If it's low MCHC, that is hypochromic, and high MCHC is hyperchromic. So you might hear someone say, oh, this is a macrocytic hyperchromic anemia, meaning large red blood cells, high levels of MCHC. So low MCHC or hypochromic cells is associated with iron deficiency. So you could actually describe that as a microcytic hypochromic anemia. Low MCV, low MCHC. And finally, RDW, essentially an indication of the degree of anisocytosis or an abnormal variation in size of red blood cells. Not really that helpful unless someone actually has an anemia. It will increase with vitamin B12, folic acid, and iron anemia. It is increased most frequently with vitamin B12. So that's looking at anemia from the sort of very general red blood cell indices. All of these are found on your complete blood count. So for that $2, you're getting a great window in here into whether or not your patients are anemic. And then we can also kind of get a gauge of, are they trending towards the microcytic type, their MCV levels are low, which would be synonymous with an iron deficiency, or a macrocytic, which would be above 89.9, which would be trending towards a B12 deficiency. Let's look at our iron deficiency anemia. We're going to look now at ferritin. That was one of those add-ons that I wanted you to put on. I'm actually going to be introducing the iron panel here, so that could also be something else that you want to add on. Very, very helpful in that respect. So let's talk a little bit about the metabolism of iron. So the majority of dietary iron is what we call the ferric form. So ferric iron has to be reduced into the ferrous iron after ingestion in order to be absorbed. And this process requires two things: stomach acid, vitamin C. Iron is absorbed primarily in the duodenum and the jejunum, the small intestine. Once absorbed, it travels in the blood attached to a beta globulin molecule called transferrin, again, something else that we can measure. And the majority of the iron is taken up by the red blood cell precursors in the bone marrow. Bone marrow takes up that iron, and then in the formation of red blood cells, attaches that iron to the hemoglobin. About 60% of the remainder is stored in the bone marrow, liver, and spleen as this component called ferritin. So ferritin is something we need to be very, very aware of, the storage form of iron. Remaining 40% is stored as a molecule called hemosiderin. Iron deficiency anemia, the most common, most prevalent anemia worldwide. A lot of different causes of it, mostly dietary inadequacies, people not consuming enough foods that have iron in them, malabsorption and or hypochlorhydria. Remember that stomach acid and vitamin C are necessary for the reduction of ferric ion into ferrous iron. If you have hypochlorhydria, chances are that you're not going to be sort of dealing with the dietary iron that you are consuming. Increased iron loss, something that we need to pay attention to, especially menstruating females that have heavy menstrual cycles, losing a lot of blood, but also something we need to pay attention to in men with a microscopic bleed as potentially a cause for iron deficiency anemia. And also increased iron requirements in pregnancy as well. So let's take a look at our iron indices. So serum iron, ferritin, percent saturation, TIBC, we could also add transferrin to this as well. Optimally, I like to see total iron between 85 and 130. Ferritin, I like to see between 30 to 70. Percent transferrin saturation between 25 and 30%. TIBC between 250 and 350. So serum iron reflects iron bound to serum proteins. Levels will begin to fall somewhere between the depletion of the iron stores and the development of anemia, useful for helping with iron deficiency anemia, monitoring treatment, can also be helpful in monitoring conditions of iron overload. Ferritin, the one that we added to our panel here, main storage form of iron, is the most sensitive test to detect iron deficiency, which is why out of all of these probably is the one to be adding to get a good sense of whether or not someone is deficient in iron. Decreased serum ferritin levels parallel tissue ferritin levels, which in turn reflect the decreased iron storage found in iron deficiency anemia. Oftentimes you'll find that the total iron is actually completely normal, but the ferritin levels are low. The body likes to keep the blood pumped up and as optimal as possible, so they will rob the stores of ferritin in order to keep the serum iron levels up. Percent saturation, calculated value, it's a more sensitive screening test for iron deficiency. Definitely add it to your panels. TIBC, total iron binding capacity, is approximate estimation of the serum transferrin levels. You can actually measure transferrin as well. Can be useful for helping determine the cause of an anemia, helping to monitor treatment. Let's take a look at our pattern here. So the patient is going to be anemic. They're going to have decreased hematocrit, decreased hemoglobin, decreased MCV, remember microcytic, decreased MCHC, hypochromic, hallmark sign of the iron deficiency anemia. You're also going to see decreased serum iron below 85. You're going to see the ferritin levels starting to go below 30. You're starting to get a decreased transferrin saturation below 16, and your RDW levels are going to go up. So very classic hallmark sign of an iron deficiency anemia. Switching gears now, we're going to look at the other thing. We're going to be looking at MCV now as a measure for B12 folate. A low MCV, as we said, is associated with iron deficiency anemia. High MCV is associated with B12 or folate deficiency. Vitamin B12 or folate deficiency will cause, and again, I'm going to throw another term out here, megaloblastic anemia, basically large cell anemia, of which vitamin B12 is probably the most common cause. So macrocytic, megaloblastic, it's just different terms that they use. B12 and folic acid are actually necessary for proper nucleus development. So in situations of B12 and folate deficiency, what ends up happening before the bone marrow will put out that red blood cell into circulation, needs to make sure that the nucleus has reached its proper size. And if you're deficient in this particular nutrient, the cell of the red blood cell is going to keep growing. The cytoplasm will grow of the erythrocyte or the red blood cell, continues to expand until the nucleus has reached its proper size. So then it gets pushed out into the body, and we now have a situation of macrocytosis or megaloblastic large cells. Why are people deficient in B12? A lot of the same things that we talked about with iron. Decreased ingestion. So people that are on a vegan diet, very few non-animal sources of B12 out there. There are some, so you have to make sure that you eat enough of those. Impaired absorption. We can have what's called an intrinsic factor deficiency. Intrinsic factor is necessary for sort of the proper absorption of B12. We have pernicious anemia, we have malabsorption, we have HCl, we have hypochlorhydria. These are all things that can impair absorption of B12. We can have increased requirements. So chronic pancreas diseases, pregnancy, hypothyroidism can all cause the increase in requirements for B12. And then impaired utilization, enzyme deficiencies, abnormal binding proteins, and things like that. So our pattern here is very different from the B12. We are going to see, obviously there's going to be an anemia. So we're going to have decreased red blood cell, decreased hematocrit, decreased hemoglobin. I didn't put that on here, but we're in terms of the indices, we're going to start to see increased MCV, increased MCH, increased MCHC, increased RDW. The LDH is going to start to creep up. You're going to see decreased uric acid. And then finally, you're going to see what's called hypersegmented neutrophils. So sometimes when they do a CBC, they will actually look at the white blood cells under a microscope. And what they'll notice is that the neutrophils are hypersegmented. So if they have 5 or more lobes in more than 5% of all neutrophils, then on the CBC in a written statement underneath, they will say hypersegmented neutrophils have been reported. It's actually quite a sensitive and reliable way of detecting megaloblastic anemia or big cell anemias. So if you are seeing this pattern here and you're just running your complete blood count in CBC, you might want to run a serum methylmalonic acid, or you might want to run a serum homocysteine level. You might actually want to run vitamin B12 as well, just to kind of broaden your picture to move beyond just the signs of this particular condition in the body to actually being able to verify whether or not there is a deficiency. So our little pattern here, as you can see, we're still going to see the same red blood cell changes here. RBC, hematocrit, hemoglobin are all going to be decreased, but then we're going to see a completely different look in terms of the various different nutrients that we're measuring. All right, LDH and blood glucose. I think of hypoglycemia as actually the first step on the road to blood sugar dysregulation. Decreased LDH is a sign of this, along with a decreased fasting glucose. Let's take a look at our ranges. LDH, I like to see between 140 and 200, blood glucose between 75 and 86. Little background here, LDH, group of enzymes that are involved in carbohydrate metabolism, found in almost every tissue in the body. It's involved with a primary catalytic conversion of pyruvate into lactate, major product of exercising muscle and red blood cell metabolism. Decreased LDH is a common finding in what we call reactive hypoglycemia, which I think of as that very first step on the road to blood sugar dysregulation. Blood glucose, traditionally viewed as a marker of diabetes. You either have it or you don't. And that's what I call kind of the nightmare of yet. Oh, your blood glucose level is below 100. You don't have diabetes yet. Let's just wait until you do, and then we can treat you with insulin and metformin. Don't get me started. I have a whole thing that I do on blood sugar dysregulation. Anyway, when viewed with some of the other tests, we can use blood glucose as a marker for the beginning stages of blood sugar dysregulation. Some of those other tests would be, hemoglobin A1C, fasting insulin, C-peptide, things like that. And we can also calculate various different markers for insulin resistance and things like that. Trend towards high glucose associated with the development of prediabetes and metabolic syndrome. A trend towards low glucose is associated with the development of reactive hypoglycemia, which I actually see as the very earliest stage of metabolic syndrome. So a reactive hypoglycemic pattern, you're going to see decreased fasting glucose below 75. Believe it or not, we do see it. It's not always elevated. And we're also going to see a decreased LDH below 140. And it's also one of those situations where you want to look at these clinical indicators. As we mentioned, LDH is an important enzyme for pyruvate metabolism. But also when we look at this particular pattern, I'm also always interested in the concept of liver glycogen metabolism. So decreased ability of the liver to store and or produce glycogen can actually be a major cause of fasting low blood sugar and hypoglycemia, especially if the ALT level is starting to go up. This type is usually ravenously hungry in the morning. A second type of hypoglycemia is the type that requires stimulation from the adrenal glands in order to release stored glycogen. They've got no problem storing glycogen in the liver and in the muscle. What they do is they have a difficulty in releasing it, and they require some kind of stimulation from a hormonal stimulation from the adrenal glands to keep blood sugar levels up during the fasting state. So remembering that cortisol levels tend to be higher in the morning, and the reason for that is that it's a glucose hormone, and its role really is to keep the glucose levels propped up while we're in a fasting state. Well, patients with this type of hypoglycemia are going to need some kind of stress in their lives in order to keep going. They need that cortisol release to stimulate the liver, that kind of type A personality that's go, go, go. They get up in the morning, grab that coffee, and they're good to go. That's your classic glycogen release issue. The second type, though, the first type that I mentioned is sort of glycogen storage. They're the type that will, move the kids out of the way in the morning just to get some food in because they just haven't been able to store glucose or glycogen in their livers and their muscles overnight. And again, that's a liver issue right there. So suspect this if you're seeing the fasting glucose below 75, decreased LDH below 140. And then these clinical indicators: strong craving for sweets, you're craving coffee or sweets in the afternoon, sleepy in the afternoon, fatigue relieved by eating, headache and or shaky if meals are skipped or delayed, irritable before meals. These are all the subjective indicators for glucose issues. Another pattern here of looking at adrenal dysfunction, we're going to be looking at this through the lens of potassium and sodium. So potassium, a main intracellular cation, acts as a primary intracellular pH buffer. Majority is found inside the cell. That's why potassium levels typically are very low, because it's an intracellular nutrient. What we're looking at here is potassium regulation. What regulates the levels of potassium in the blood? And how can we use that as a way to be able to infer whether or not the adrenals are in a state of balance? Potassium concentration greatly influenced by the mineral corticoid adrenal hormone called aldosterone. Potassium excretion is controlled by aldosterone's effect on the kidney. Increase aldosterone levels. So if you're in a state of adrenal stress, when you're pumping out cortisol and you're pumping out aldosterone, this can cause an increased excretion of potassium from the urine. You're wasting potassium out with stress, and your serum levels will be low. And because of this, we can look at this as a marker for trend towards adrenal dysfunction. I like to see potassium between 4 and 4.5. I like to see sodium between 135 and 142. And I like my sodium potassium ratio to be between 30 to 35. First pattern we're going to be looking at is actually the opposite of what I just talked about. This is going to be adrenal insufficiency. So in an insufficiency state, the body's not producing much cortisol, not producing the glucocorticoids, not producing the mineralocorticoid hormones. We're going to get a decrease in that aldosterone, decrease in the amount of renal potassium excretion. This causes the potassium levels in the blood to go up. Conversely, sodium, actually, aldosterone has a completely opposite effect. So low levels of aldosterone actually causes an increase in renal sodium excretion. So the sodium level will start to go down. Sodium potassium ratio will be decreased below 30. Chloride values will often follow the sodium, so they will be low. Other values that may be out of balance include an increased triglyceride or cholesterol level. So anytime you're sort of in a more hypometabolic state, a lot of these blood fats start to go up. And then obviously, if you are measuring aldosterone or cortisol levels, they will be decreased. Conversely, the adrenal stress pattern is completely the opposite. Potassium levels are going to be decreased. Remember, aldosterone levels will be up, causing high levels of potassium to be excreted in the urine. Completely different effect on the sodium. The sodium is going to be held onto, and so you're going to see an increased sodium as well, and you'll see the sodium potassium ratio being increased above 35. So this is a really nice way of looking at these electrolytes from a complete metabolic panel, using this ratio of sodium potassium to kind of gauge whether or not a patient is moving in or trending towards adrenal dysfunction. This is where gateway testing would come in, right? You're seeing this pattern. Now it's an opportunity to start doing some salivary cortisol studies or do a Dutch test to kind of get a sense of what's really happening by measuring actual levels of cortisol, measuring DHEA, looking at the cortisol DHEA ratios and things like that. One of our last metabolic patterns, we're going to be looking at renal insufficiency by looking at BUN and creatinine. BUN formed from urea. Its levels start to go up when we have kidney problems. The majority of urea is excreted as BUN through the kidney. If we start seeing increased BUN levels, we're presuming that either the liver is producing too much or we're getting decreased excretion by the kidney, which is primarily the pattern we're going to be looking at. Creatinine, disorder of the kidney and or urinary tract will reduce the excretion of creatinine, thus raising blood serum levels. I like to see BUN between 10 and 16, creatinine between 0.8 and 1.1. Renal insufficiency, kind of an interesting condition here. It's basically a slow decrease in kidney function. So they haven't moved into overt renal disease, the kidneys just aren't functioning properly. It's a little bit like liver dysfunction. The liver is just kind of getting sluggish. The gallbladder is starting to get sluggish. So kidney functions more than just a filter for waste and toxins, regulates fluid and mineral balance, helps regulate blood pressure, regulates acid-base balance, secretes hormones, erythropoietin for the stimulation of red blood cell production. So kidneys actually do a lot of things in the body. So when you start seeing renal insufficiency or decrease in function of the kidneys, can actually have effects outside of just the kidneys themselves. What is one of the major causes of renal insufficiency? One is dehydration, high protein intake. So if your patients are really pounding the protein and not drinking enough fluids along with it, diets high in processed food, sugar, caffeine, alcohol. A lot of drugs can affect the kidneys, heavy metals, especially cadmium, which actually slowly destroys the glomeruli. Also, mercury does the same thing. And also infections can be a cause of this. I actually think that impaired liver dysfunction or impaired liver function causing liver dysfunction can actually lead to putting extra stress on the kidneys that can also lead to an increase in what we call renal insufficiency. So an increased BUN above 16, again, differentiated then from Hypochlorhydria pattern that we looked at because BUN will be increased in that as well. Increase of normal creatinine above 1.1, uric acid levels will start to go up, phosphorus levels will start to go up. So this is something to pay attention to. And I'm always talking to patients about needing to monitor how much diuretics they're using, replacing them with pure water. How much water are you consuming? Are you replacing electrolytes after athletic activities and things like that? And this really is our final pattern. I know we're running a little bit late here, so I appreciate you staying on. This is the role that white blood cell count plays in the assessment of what we call immune insufficiency. I like to see white blood cell count between 5.5 and 7.5, globulins between 2.5 and 2.8. Those are the two biomarkers that we're going to take a look at. Sudden onset of symptoms. These are some of the symptoms that are associated with immune insufficiency. Some of the most common ones would be tender lymph nodes, muscle pain and weakness, multiple joint pain with swelling or tenderness, recurrent headaches. A lot of this is associated with what we call viral infections. So these could be subacute viral infections that you may not even be aware that your patients are dealing with. Primary one would be Epstein-Barr. You can measure the 4 different types of immunoglobulins to Epstein-Barr to kind of get a sense of whether or not we're looking at an active infection or a reactivated infection in the patient. Cytomegalovirus can be an issue. Herpes simplex 1 and 2, human herpes virus 6, Candida, a lot of other viruses, parasites, bacteria. What ends up happening is the immune system requires the body to be in a fairly acute state of homeostatic balance. And so when the homeostatic balance becomes weakened, then these types of invading pathogens take up residence in the body. And we can actually look at some of the immune biomarkers that we've already looked at today to kind of give us a sense of whether or not this patient might be in this state of immune insufficiency. Albumin levels will be decreased, globulin levels will be decreased. The big one here is total white blood cell count becomes decreased. And then we also get a decreased alkaline phosphatase. If you suspect immune insufficiency, follow up with the appropriate testing for viruses and bacteria in your patients. Again, something that we see with COVID as well, this sort of down-regulation of the immune system that happens. So that's 11 metabolic patterns that we went through from the CBC and Common Metabolic Panel, plus I think I gave you an extra one in there. I really just touched the surface on the amount of functionally relevant information you can gather simply by looking at patterns between the biomarkers on a blood, chem, and CBC panel. So if you want to kind of stay in touch with my work, I do have some free resources at optimaldx.com. I've got the FBCA blueprint if you want to learn how to implement this into your clinic. I also have blood biomarker guides that you can print out and share with your patient. I have a software program, come to optimaldx.com. This basically takes all of the blood biomarkers, produces this functional health report that can be either printed out for your patient. We typically recommend that you look at it on a computer screen because it is an interactive PDF, great for doing this type of Zoom type meetings with your clients. And then finally, I have a training program. For those of you who want more knowledge, you can come and join my FBCA Mastery training program. Certification, it's 36-hour training. You join at the certification level, you get a 3-month free software account. So that's about a $525 value right there. So if you're interested in learning more about my work, come on over to the training program. And finally, we're going to give you this download. It's a guide called the FBC biomarkers and their associated conditions. So we run through the biomarkers and we talk about the conditions that are associated with high and low levels. So that's it for me. Anthony, I know we went over a little bit, but quick run through here in the CBC Metabolic Panel.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Weatherby. You did a really great job today. And I think we all learned a lot. These fundamentals of the CBC and the chem panels are so important for any healthcare practitioner to know. So thanks for giving your expertise on this today. We did receive a lot of questions during the presentation, and I think we're going to try to get most of those now.
You could always send them to me and I could write up some responses. So you're going to get, more of a less from up here and maybe more from just looking at research and things. But either way, we can do it either way you want.
So I think we can get to probably a handful now as well. And as Dr. Weatherby, if you have additional questions, feel free to reach out. So let's jump into the live Q&A though. And let's go over the first question. That is going to be, what instructions do you recommend giving patients prior to getting these blood tests done?
Fasting. So yeah, absolutely. I recommend a fasting blood test. So what does that really mean? So that means nothing by mouth from 8 o'clock in the evening onwards. And I say that loosely, I mean food by mouth. You can drink lots and lots of fresh, pure water, no juice, no coffee, no tea. So just pure water after 8 o'clock. I would recommend that you get the blood drawn before 10 o'clock. Otherwise, you're putting the body into sort of a metabolic pattern where it's trying to sort of compensate for the fasting state. So the earlier they can do it the next morning, the better. Also, I like the fasting because it's, like I said, you get that blood test at a fairly consistent time. So if you're looking at blood tests over time, which we look at in historical reporting, you can be pretty sure that you're looking at a blood test where the blood has been drawn usually between 8 and 10 o'clock in the morning. And that can become really helpful when you're looking at some of the thyroid biomarkers. TSH, for instance, has variability across the day, as do some of the other biomarkers. So that's what I would recommend. People often ask me, do I tell patients to come off their supplements, stay on their supplements, all this sort of stuff? I would say there's two things. One is if you're wanting to see whether or not the protocol that you've put them on is having an influence on the biomarkers that you use to get them on that protocol in the first place, have them continue to be on their supplements. Recognizing that someone is taking B12, then or vitamin D, probably their levels will be slightly increased just because of the levels that are floating around in the blood from the supplements. But if you're also wanting to see whether or not someone is able to compensate without the nutritional supplements, then stop them about 5 days before and see kind of how they're compensating without that nutritional supplementation. So that's kind of what my answer to that would be.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, let's move on to question number 2, which is, you mentioned some additional biomarkers to get the most out of the fasting glucose test. Could you run through those once again?
Yeah, absolutely. So remember, fasting glucose is just that snapshot of blood glucose regulation, right? So it can be affected by what they've eaten, maybe the night, well, maybe not the night before, but the day before. If the heavy, high carbohydrate meals might affect that. So along with the blood glucose, there are a few biomarkers that I would recommend. One would be hemoglobin A1C, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with, gives us a 2 to 3 month window into blood sugar regulation. And from that, we can calculate the estimated average glucose. That gets us 2 new biomarkers. I would also recommend C-peptide and or fasting insulin. I like to do both. And then once we get the C-peptide, the fasting insulin, and the blood glucose, we can actually start calculating what is called the HOMA2 calculations. And we do this in the software. This gives us 3 incredible biomarkers for insulin resistance. We get the HOMA2 IR, or insulin resistance score. Anything above 1.4 is really clinically significant for insulin resistance. We also get beta cell output, a reading of, are they putting out enough insulin or are they putting out too much insulin? And then thirdly, we get the %S score, which tells us about insulin sensitivity at the cellular level. High levels of %S, your cells are really nicely sensitive. Low levels of %S, meaning that your cells are less sensitive. The reciprocal of that would give us our insulin resistance score. We can also get what's called a quickie measurement. Again, another little measure for insulin resistance. So just adding in fasting glucose, hemoglobin A1C, and fasting insulin and C-peptide, we now have expanded our window into blood sugar regulation. You can also look at adiponectin, you can look at glycomark, you can look at leptin. So those are kind of the full blood sugar regulation biomarkers to take a look at.
Super important. Wow, those are some really important biomarkers.
Just finishing up there, sorry, Anthony, if you have never heard of the HOMA calculator, come on over to Optimal DX, go to my blog. In fact, one of my podcasts, I did an interview with Dr. Brad Rackman about how he uses the HOMA 2 calculator in his clinic. He shared some incredible clinical information on that. I've written some research articles on HOMA 2. So go over to optimaldx.com/blog. You're gonna have to search around a little bit to kind of find them, but I've done individual articles on each of those. So pretty cool stuff.
Thank you, Dr. Weatherby. Okay, on to question number 3 is how important is it to run a full iron panel when trying to get to the bottom of iron deficiency anemia?
I think it's very important. I focused in on ferritin. As we saw, ferritin is actually relatively cheap. I'm not sure actually, Anthony, if Rupa actually puts together an iron panel in and of itself, but if it is, go ahead and get the whole iron panel. It's probably going to cost you $10 or your patient's $10. And it's going to be really, really helpful for not only working out whether or not the patient is iron deficient, and if they're not, those indices can also help you pinpoint, are we looking at a beta thalassemia, or are we looking at other conditions as well? So really, really important. So I'm going to run through those: serum iron, ferritin, percent saturation, TIBC, UIBC, and transferrin. So 6 biomarkers will be part of that iron panel.
Amazing. And yes, you can find that entire iron panel with Rupa Health. So cool. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Weatherby. Question number 4 is, what kind of panels do you recommend to get the most out of software reporting?
Oh boy. Yeah. Again, I've got 3 panels that I recommend. So in those situations, if you are using the software and you're wanting to get kind of the full functional health report, definitely the biomarkers that we talked about today is going to give you a good reporting. But if you come over to, in fact, I tell you what, Anthony, I'm going to send you a PDF of 3 panels that I would recommend. We call our kind of ODX panels. So maybe you could put that up with the review. Would that work? And that way they can kind of look and see the levels of 3 different panels that we could put together. Not sure if Rupa allows, do you allow for practitioners to be able to kind of make their own panels from blood testing?
Yes. So at Rupa Health, all practitioners are allowed to make their own panels, mix and match, choose however they want to kind of bundle those.
So yeah, so maybe, I don't know if you guys wanted to put together my 3 ODX panels and call them the ODX panels. I don't know, whatever you wanted to do, make them available that way, either through Vibrant or Access. But yeah, kind of the more the merrier, basically. But there is a minimum amount that that you need.
Perfect. And yes, absolutely, we can create some specific bundles, exclusive, that are your own, essentially ODX and Dr. Weatherby's panels, so that everybody can choose. Thank you for that. All right, and then we have time for just one more question today. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. So last question is going to be, what other tests can you recommend for assessing oxidative stress?
Great question. Because I did mention that when we're not actually measuring oxidative stress in these panels, what we're looking at are the effects that oxidative stress has on individual biomarkers. You know, so some of the things that I think about would be maybe some of the cancer markers. So acid phosphatase, you could even do a serum protein electrophoresis, which is pretty in-depth, looking at the breakdowns of various different proteins, can kind of tell you what's going on. Anti-malignant antibodies, alpha fetoproteins. To be honest with you, I actually like to go sort of outside of the blood chemistry, and I like to look at organic acids. I'm not an expert on organic acids by any means, but there are, I think, a number of different biomarkers on what they call an OAT test, an organic acid test. Actually, wouldn't say OAT test, on the OAT, where you can look for mitochondrial activity, and I believe antioxidant status. I can't remember what they are off the top of my head, but I know that Genova has a few panels. Yeah, maybe just go over to Rupa and type in organic acids, and I'm sure that Vibrant has one. I believe that the Great Plains, I think their oat or organic acid test is probably one of the best. So yeah, run an organic acid. I think organic acid testing is like the Chem Screen and CBC of the urine. So they work so well together, and I wish I knew more about them. Maybe you could put me in touch with someone that's really good at organic acid interpretation. No, the organic acid test I think would be a really good one for oxidative stress, definitely. And I know that Rupa has a whole load of different organic acid tests from all the various different companies that that you have there.
Great call, Dr. Weatherby. Such a very important and interesting test, the organic acid test. And yes, you can find a lot of different kinds from different companies, as you mentioned on the website. All right, it looks like we are out of time. Thank you for your great questions, everybody that submitted them. And thank you so much for attending this live class. I want to give a huge shout out to Dr. Weatherby and Optimal DX. He's a true legend in this functional medicine space and did just an amazing job today. So
thank you.
Thank you again. And we hope to see you all at the next live class. And thanks again for attending.